Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Russell Banks, twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, joins us this week to discuss his new novel, Foregone. In the novel, we meet Canadian-American leftist documentary filmmaker Leonard Fife, one of 60,000 draft evaders and deserters who fled to Canada to avoid serving in Vietnam. Fife, now in his late 70s, is dying of cancer in Montreal and has agreed to a final interview in which he is determined to bare all his secrets at last, to demythologize his mythologized life. This show is recorded as part of a virtual author event with Northshire Bookstore, northshire.com. A prolific writer of fiction, Russell Banks' titles include The Darling, The Sweet Hereafter, Cloud Splitter, Rule of the Bone, Affliction, Success Stories, and Continental Drift, just to name a few. It is a great pleasure to welcome our dear friend Russell Banks back to the Book Show. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, Joe. It's great to see you, even virtually.
Well, it's wonderful to see you. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this novel. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. And I find what I enjoyed so much about it is I don't know the last time I enjoyed a book so much about a character who is really fairly despicable.
And I know that's the risk I took, I think, with it. But it's been true. So many of my protagonists over the years, they're the kind of people you would like to judge, and in some ways dismiss, and not have to think about, and not have to humanize in any way. But those are the people I'm most attracted to, and that's sort of the work that I try most to do, is to take a character like Leonard Fife, who is morally compromised through most of his life, and is trying desperately at the very end of his life to find a way to redemption, find a way to redeem himself from the many sins. They aren't crimes, but many sins that he has committed over his life. And the only way he can imagine doing it, I suppose, is to be a character in a novel by Russell Banks, but that's what's happened. But you think of Nick, of Bob Du Bois in Continental Drift, and who's similarly flawed, and John Brown in Cloud Splitter, or Wade Whitehouse in Affliction, and so on. I mean, these are characters who are profoundly, deeply, and in some ways frighteningly flawed, and yet it's important to humanize them, to find a way to see their humanity, and for them to find a way to see it themselves, in themselves, I think. And Leonard Fife is in that tradition, I guess.
So this is really for him a deathbed confessional of telling people, really, ultimately his wife, the truth. And he sees it as his last chance. There's a documentary film crew, and they want him to tell one story, one set of stories, and he wants to tell a completely different set of stories, which basically is to set his record straight.
Right, and he's telling the story in a way that doesn't make sense to the listeners. This was the structural problem and difficulty with the book in some ways, was how can I let a man tell his story in a way that is true to his own subjective experience when the man himself is addled. His brain is addled by illness. He's dying of cancer, by medication, by age, and how can I reveal in a novel what he experiences subjectively, and also reveal, in contrast to that, what is being heard by and filmed by these more objective and detached listeners, the filmmaker and his producer and his sound person and his cameraman, and most importantly, his wife. So it alternates back and forth between the two narratives. And one narrative is the subjective experience of Leonard Fife as he recalls his life and it's how he recalls it. It's not how he's saying it, however, or how he's revealing it to the camera. And the other is the response of the camera crew and the director as they're listening to him, and it's not quite making sense. it's not quite cohering for them. And it's certainly in stark contrast to the kind of questions they had already raised.
Which makes it so fascinating because they're continually, the people in the room are continually asking him, guiding him in some ways, asking him, did that really happen? Or perhaps you can tell us more about this. He's having a regular running conversation with his wife. I want to tell you this. And she said, well, I know what I need to know. I don't really need to know anything else. I wondered, to write that, you said there were challenges. Did you make the decision that you had to know what the truth was before you could hear his version of it?
How much did I know about his story before I got him to tell it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because it's so gauzy in places, and it skips. So do you have to know and have the structure of what it is, or do you want to be like us in the sense of not really sure as to where all those pieces are?
I think I had to invent it as I went along to a large degree. I knew the rough outline of it. I mean, from the first chapter, he's going to die by the end of this book. It's not exactly a secret.
Spoiler alert.
and he's going to be revealing some unseemly truths that are going to run counter to his publicly perceived persona. And that I knew that much, certainly at the beginning. I also knew that I was going to take him back to a lifetime of personal abandonments of responsibility, and more particularly of an inability. I was going to take him back to an inability to properly love the people who loved him. In the end, it's a book about love, and about the difficulty of it, and the need at the end of life to somehow understand that and try to express that when you have spent most of your life in denial of that, and most of your life, in effect, betraying that.
You write later in the novel, it is another reason for wanting Emma there. She is the only one who can bridge the gap between his memories and his description of them, as if he is speaking in a language that only she and he understand. He and Emma are his brain's only native speakers. This is love, is it not? That is a beautiful line.
Yeah, that's terribly important to me in this book. I mean, that's the spine of it in some ways, is the attempt to find a way to evoke in oneself the quality of attention that we call love. There's a moment in the book where the young woman who's the sound person in the film crew takes the mic off him and moves it and all. And, he's in his late 70s, and he's ill, and he's lost half his body weight. He's in a wheelchair, and this very young 20-something-year-old woman brushes up close to him and in an intimate way to remove the microphone. And he pays incredible attention to her. And it's not lust of any sort. It's just like her physical presence is incredibly powerful to him. And then he reflects from there. And that's a passage that I actually like. I mean, one doesn't like to say that one likes particular passages in one's book, but that's the one where he reflects. He says, if I had paid that kind of attention to my first wife, and to my second, and to my children, my life would have been totally different. I would have been able to love them.
There is a point where you write, if he dies without having told her, Emma, his wife, having told her the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, then she'll have loved and married and been the 40-year partner of a purely fictional character. You seem to play with that throughout the novel, of this idea of what is true, what is memory, what is not true, what we have told ourselves, what we believe, what we don't believe. Those are all fascinating, especially as you mentioned earlier, in this character, because it's an addled brain as well.
It's terribly important to the book, and it became important to me a few years ago. I mean, this is a book I don't think I could have written when I was younger for various reasons. One of them is that a man I very much loved in his last years was suffering from dementia. As a result, he was confabulating. What I had never experienced that up close before. I'd never seen someone confabulate, where they bring together into a narrative that is utterly believable to themselves, that's made of memory and of fantasy and of dreams and of movies they may have seen, of things that actually happened, in which time collapses and things that happened 50 years ago seem to be happening today. And so on. That confabulation is an extraordinary mental state, and familiar to most of us who have been close to or know people who suffered from dementia or Alzheimer's. Or it also happens under medication and other conditions like that. I started trying to imagine what that must be like, where it's totally believable to him, and his narrative, as he tries to explain what he's experiencing, what he's remembering, and what he thinks is true about his life, makes no sense to the listener. And so, how do you present that in a novel where you're saying the subjective experience of the character is totally coherent to him, but rather incoherent, almost utterly incoherent to the listener to whom he's speaking? And I realized as I tried to imagine that and tried to understand that in this person that I loved so much, what it was like. It was so close to what I think of as fiction writing. This is what a fiction writer does: brings together and confabulates. I mean, it's with fabulation, confabulate. And I began to think, this is how I write my books and how I think when I'm writing fiction. And so I integrated that insight into the novel. And there are, as you point out, there are moments and cues and places where another critic called it metatextuality, where there is a yeah, right, but there is a kind of self-consciousness, certainly on my part, where I'm saying, I know this is how it is to write fiction. This is how it is to confabulate. This may be how it is to die.
Russell Banks is our guest on this week's book show. The new novel is Foregone. Much of the idea behind the novel, of course, is that Leonard is one of the 60,000 draft evaders and deserters who fled to Canada to avoid serving in Vietnam. You tell us in the first chapter that is the story that ultimately is being told to the documentary filmmakers, but obviously for Leonard there is a twist to that. What brought you to that fact that 60,000 individuals and wanting to explore that and have that at times very much in the foreground, but certainly almost always in the background?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a factor in my own life in some ways, going back to the 60s, when I was part of the opposition to the war, first in Chapel Hill, and then later when I returned to New Hampshire in the late 60s, early 70s. And I knew many people moving through that particular channel. I mean, they were in flight, and I knew people who were advising them and helping them escape into Canada. So that was a factor, and there are other factors too, I suppose, involved. One is that it's partly a forgotten episode in American history, and a rather dramatic and interesting and unique one. Not since, in a way, the Revolutionary War, when loyalists fled to Canada to escape the new republic, have that many Americans gone north, and so that was important to me. And I am myself Canadian and Canadian American. My father's Canadian. 3 of my grandparents are Canadian. And I've lived most of my adult life on the borders of the border of Canada, in the Northeast, in New Hampshire, and here now in upstate New York. So it's that part of it drew me as well, toward this particular aspect of the story. And then two, he's a man in his late 70s looking back to that era and trying to understand it. And so are most of my generation. So is most of my generation, trying to figure it out. When you're in your 70s, what the hell was going on when you were in your 20s? And you know, you're approaching your own mortality face on, and long ago you didn't even occur to you that that was going to be the drama of your life, your own mortality. The final story was going to be the story, and I began to get that. A number of I'm of a certain age, obviously. I'm 81, and so most of my contemporaries, my generation, and many of my closest friends, you know, have been dying. So mortality, my mortality, was inescapable, and it had to become a major subject. And when that becomes a major subject, then so does your youth, so does how you got here become a major subject. I mean, I know it's a particular kind of book, and it has the long view. But at the moment, at this point in my own personal life, that's sort of the only view I think is available to me.
For the filmmakers, for those who want to know more about Leonard's life, they're asking questions about that larger issue of going to Canada, as well as his films and what he saw and what he got on film at any given time. And those are the questions they want to ask. Those are the questions on those cards. And as I mentioned, he has his own ideas, but his story eclipses that, because there's so much, even as a young man, by the time he gets to Canada, has lived a hell of a life.
Yeah, right. No, that's true. And of course that's true for all of us. But I wanted to make that the driving drama of his story, not what happened after he got to Canada, but what happened before he got to Canada, and how and why he went there. And I, you know, I hope that is clear, and I hope that that's also dramatically engaging and interesting as well, and revealing too. I mean, as I said, I'm at an age now where I look back and I say, what is more responsible for my character, the shape of my life, the relations that I treasure in my life. What's more responsible for that than those early years? And so you're forced to examine them again and go back and look at them closely and evaluate them as much as possible from this distance.
I think it is also interesting that film is such a part of this. I know your interest in film. I know that you have spent many years with film festivals and working in and around that. We are told throughout the book the power of editing. Leonard, you can talk all you want. You can talk for 2.5 hours. You can tell us this. This may end up being 7 minutes on screen, maybe.
Right. Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, I've been very fortunate in my work with filmmakers, and a couple of them have particularly helped out with this book. I sent a copy of the manuscript early on to Adam Agoyan, who made the film The Sweet Hereafter, and asked him, and he's Canadian too, which helped, and said, can you vet this for me? Will you, just go make sure I got the details correct, and so on. And another filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, Denny Mueller, I asked him also to vet it and look through it and make sure that I was presenting a filmmaker's novel, that it would not violate, any of their sense of the reality of what they do. And they were both very helpful. And indeed, I changed a few things as a result of their help. But I was also very interested in that process of editing. That is such a fascinating aspect to filmmaking, and very close to what a novelist does in revision, and going back over and reshaping a narrative. There's a marvelous book by Michael Ondaatje and Walter Murch, who's Coppola's DP, director of photography for many years, and it's a book published, I think, in Canada, but it's a great book about a filmmaker talking to a fiction writer about how common and how interesting their process is. But the filmmaker is an editor, not a director, and that's really interesting and important. Another aspect of filmmaking, which I know informed this too, is that years ago in the 90s, when I was first getting deeply involved in filmmaking, and it was in the making of Affliction and the making of The Sweet Hereafter, and I was hanging out with actors and directors and DPs and so forth, and I had thought up to that point that the novelist is closest to a director, because you're in charge, you're the main man, the main woman, this is your project, etc. And I began to realize slowly, no, novelists are more like actors, because I realized actors embody the characters. They get inside the characters and look out their eyes. And that's really what it is also to be a novelist, is that you get inside the character and you look out through their eyes. You don't really know what it's like to be in the same room with them any more than you know what it's like to be in the same room with yourself. But you do know what it's like to be in the same room with all these other people. So I saw closely the parallel between them. And so that leads me to the analogy, I suppose, between Leonard Fife, who was inside himself looking out, trying to externalize himself, trying to make himself known with the greatest of difficulty. And to do that, you just got to give up the secret self in order to make that possible. So there are a lot of serious and intentional, and some not so intentional, parallels to filmmaking in this, as there are a lot of serious, intentional, and not so intentional parallels to writing novels in this as well. And then I suppose too, there's a great deal in it that is an attempt to show, dramatize, and live with the difficulties and the profound meaning of love between a man and a woman, or any two human beings.
You mentioned this earlier about your Canadian roots, as well as wanting the Canadian perspective on it as you were working on this. How do you think this is landing in Canada?
Well, gee, I spent a lot of time the last week talking to Canadian journalists. They seem to really be grabbing at it, and I'm grateful for it in many ways, in as much as it points to a historical aspect of Canada that has gotten rather little attention, both in Canada and in the United States, and particularly the development of Agent Orange in Canada. That's a big series of episodes there, a film that Leonard Fife made about the involvement of Canadian government and Canadian military in developing Agent Orange during the Vietnam era, even as they were happily welcoming 60,000 American deserters and draft dodgers into Canada. So they're glad to hear that story being told. And today, I was talking to a journalist in Montreal, and much of this novel is set in Montreal, and you always get nervous when you're talking to a journalist who owns the territory that you're talking to, and if you screwed up an address or any little detail, he's going to jump or she's going to jump all over you. And I was very grateful that he said, "No, you got exactly the right details. You got it right. You got Sherbrooke. I know that block. I know that place, and so forth and so on." And so it's very gratifying, I must say. Small pleasures for a novelist.
One of the things that I loved, you seem to really work through the idea that there's such tension in that room. And there are people who are trying to alleviate it. There are people who are adding to it. Everyone's trying to work with Leonard. But there is such tension. And as you say, we know the guy's going to die too. So there's that tension. This despicable character. It's also a lovely story. And there's just those gentle moments as well through that great tension.
I hope so. I like to think that the character of the Haitian nurse, Renee Jacques, is a way for that to happen. His interrelations with her, which opens with her wheeling his wheelchair out into the black box of the room where they're going to be filming it, and his ongoing dialogue with her, and she's caring for him, of course, in the most intimate ways. And she has a kind of, I think, beautiful detachment where she both loves him almost. I mean, she's caring for him. She humanizes him. He's a human being to her. He may be a famous leftist documentary filmmaker to the world, but to her, he's a dying man and her patient, and she's taking care of him. And I hope there's an important kind of transaction goes on between the two, and she functions in the novel to me sort of like a Greek chorus in a way. He's unreliable, the people around him are unreliable, but she is clearly reliable.
Well, it's such a beautiful novel. It is Foregone. It is published by Echo. Russell Banks, it's always a great pleasure to have you on our program. I thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's been great to be with you again.
We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. This show was recorded as part of a virtual author event with Northshire Bookstore, northshire.com. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening. For The Book Show, I'm Joe Donahue.